introduce myself. I'm Gordon Morrison, President of Stort Valley Rotary. Prior to COVID-19 appeared on these shores, the club met at a pub for a meal, enjoyed the food, the company, and listened to our excellent speakers. At the start of these meetings, one of our members, Peter Blasko, said grace, a grace that would carry some relevance to the speaker. That has now changed. So tonight, Peter is going to give his thought for today. Peter.
Good evening. Am I audible to everyone? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yes, not so much a grace, a thought for today, with apologies to John Macefield, because I call this cabin fever. You'll recognise the meter, I think. I look forward to seeing the sea again, under the wide East Anglian sky, and sitting in a seaside pub again, with a beer and a pork pie. And all I ask is to get around again, with my bus pass rover, and meeting family and friends again, when this isolation's over. But there are bright things around to dispel any sign of gloom, like meeting as a Rotary Club, though each in our own room. By means of computer wizardry and electronic stealth, we'll meet Brian, who'll tell of progress made in children's mental health.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm sure there's a round of applause behind all these screens.
Nobody can see anything.
Right, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of our speaker after the talk. But in the meantime, we're all muted, so we can all focus on hearing what Brian's got to say. Questions can be asked through the chat, but there's a box which says chat. If you go on there and direct a question to my name, you can ask questions during the talk. Now, I'm delighted that so many have joined us tonight. We've got 28 participants. Brian Littlechild is Professor of Social Work at the University of Hertfordshire and has a recognised expertise in a wide area of social behaviour and mental health. Now, Stort Valley Rotary's primary aim is to support child mental health, an area where there's a growing need, a need that is bound to increase once life gets back to normal. So I will now hand you over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come along to this to talk about what I think, obviously, are very important issues. Two of my passions are about working with young people and issues of mental health. What I'm proposing to do, I'm going to give this a try. It's a bit unfair having to come on after Peter, actually. That was excellent. Thank you very much. So I'll do my best to follow on from that. So I've got some PowerPoints. So Gordon will tell me if they're working or not, and other people will, I'm sure. And if there are any questions in the chat, Gordon, if you can let me know, please, because I'll be looking at my screen with the PowerPoints, if that's okay.
We'll hold questions back to the end.
Okay, thank you.
Brian's about to share his screen.
Okay. Is that working, folks?
Yes, that's working well.
Yep. Thank you very much. So, as Gordon said, my name's Brian Littlechild. I'm Professor of Social Work at the University of Hertfordshire. My background was and is also as a professional social worker. And over the years, I've worked in a number of areas. I actually started off in residential work with an organisation called Cyrenians, actually, in terms of single homelessness. And that was in Hammersmith in London. And we bought up, well, didn't buy anything, but we had some old houses that we used to work in and provide places for people leaving prison, psychiatric hospitals, and off the street. It was a good start because we had a 36-hour week, except that was the time we had off. The rest of the time we lived in and we were resident there. And I'm trying to remember now, I think because we had our keep found for us, we were on the same rates as people on income support, which I think I'm making it up now, but it's something like £1.11 or something, just to show you how old and how long I've been around. From that, I went to work in various psychiatric hospitals. Shenley, if people remember that, Claybury Hospital in Essex, and severals in Essex. So I've got a background in work of mental health in various ways. I've worked a lot with young people over the years as a social worker and as a manager, looked after children, youth offending. I still work with young people who are in trouble with the law in something called referral panels, which I would urge people to think about getting involved with. I think it's an excellent way to contribute to young people's welfare, except we're not doing any at the moment, of course, because of COVID. So my panels that I normally chair aren't happening. So hopefully we're keeping the support and keeping an eye on those young people. So in terms of what we're talking about this evening, what I want us to do, please, is to think about some of the main issues that can inform our knowledge about young people. Crucially, I think, how they're experiencing their world and how this may lead to stresses and mental health problems. In particular, I think it's important that we think about the types of things which families can help with for each other in terms of support. And actually, Gordon, I can hear myself speaking now back through there, so I'm going to try and do something about that.
Your sound is coming over fine, Brian.
Okay, it's just feeding it back to me through my microphone, so I might take that out for the moment. Okay, that helps. We'll also look at the effects that there are. Okay. Can people hear me okay now?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Thank you. One of the key areas, I think, for young people, and particularly the family members who are supporting them, there are ways we can think in terms of our own personal lives. A number of us may know people with mental health problems. We may know a number of people in our own families who have got some level of mental health challenge. And I think we can look at some of the statistics, we can look at some of the particular issues in terms of services, which we will do. And towards the end of this, I'll give some indications of where people can go to for help and support in different ways in doing this. But I think one of the most important things is actually understanding what it might be like for people who are experiencing mental health challenges of different types and what it's like for people supporting them. So as an academic, I will tell you some of the other stuff, but I'm not going to concentrate on that. Hopefully we'll do the things which relate more to what we can actually do in terms of our everyday lives in terms of this. So I'll look at the background to some of the issues about how we see mental health, particularly in relation to young people, the incidents, the effects, and effective supports for young people and their families. So, we're quite a rich society at the moment. We'll see where we are in a couple of years after all of COVID and everything else. But in essence, we're one of the richest countries in the world. That's helped enormously in all sorts of ways in parts of our lives, but for quite a number of people, and especially some of our young people, that's not a correlation really with an increase overall in well-being and mental health. In fact, some people would argue that our young people probably are in a more fragile state in terms of their mental health and well-being than ever. There are lots of ideas and theories as why that might be the case, and some of those relate to pressures on young people in terms of education, achieving in life. Particularly, we're looking at an increase in bullying over social media, which I'm sure people are aware of, and some of the effects of that. Peer pressure relates to that. That also relates to why young people might get into offending in terms of how they think they're seen by others, how they think they've got to seem, who they can get involved in, who they're valued by, a number of areas in relation to that. Another area is in terms of family functioning, in terms of what might happen in families, in terms of supporting young people or maybe creating stresses for them. We know that where young people have been abused in some form, and the trauma that can come from that is quite highly correlated with mental health challenges during adolescence and later on in life. And changes in family structure have also been important, some people would say, in relation to this, particularly where there are stresses where parents have split up or divorced. And most of the evidence isn't about the splitting up necessarily, it's about the acrimony that comes with that. So actually, as long as people can work out things well for their children and young people, that can be fine for people's well-being and future. It depends how it's worked out between the adults. In terms of incidents, well, there are major psychotic conditions present for young people, but the great majority of problems that young people experience are related to anxiety and depression, and there's been a large increase in those areas in recent decades. Depression overall is the most common mental health condition, followed by anxiety, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders. Around half of all mental health illnesses begin by the age of 14. Preventing and identifying mental health issues as early as possible is really important in terms of effective treatment and recovery. And we'll look at some of the important issues around those who work in schools, in families, friends, in terms of the sorts of ways in which we can help maybe spot and also support young people and the families trying to support those young people in terms of some of the stresses that there might be for them. There's been an increase in ADHD and Asperger's diagnoses in recent years. Eating disorders, which used to be mainly for young women, but is now becoming more of an issue for young men. And suicide is particularly an issue for 10 to 24-year-old females, although one of the highest risk groups is actually adult men in their 40s. So there are a number of areas in terms of risk factors, if you like, in terms of those, and the sorts of effects there can be through isolation, through feelings of anxiety, through to people taking or attempting to take their own lives. In terms of adults, the accepted wisdom is something like 1 in 4 of the population have some form of mental health challenge. The National Audit Office did a study 2 years ago, and they looked at the incidence from the best evidence that they could find, and they took the estimate that something like 1 in 10 of 5 to 16-year-olds have a mental health condition which could valuably be treated in some way or another. But we'll look at that later as well, because it's not just about medication, and in fact normally medication is avoided as far as possible for a number of reasons. Although we know that's the case, about 25% of children and young people who have a diagnosable condition actually receive help from the services that there are available. And there may be a number of reasons for that. And part of that is in terms of the resources for those, and we'll look at that a little later. But a lot of it comes down to issues of stigma and labelling that we'll come to in a while about what people might feel, how others see them, and how they see themselves if they're going through mental distress of the areas that we're talking about. The National Audit Office also came up with how these problems can have long-term deleterious consequences, negative consequences. And they also reported their finding from the research that adolescence and early adulthood are the main times at which there's an onset of a mental disorder. 75% of all diagnoses and onset are before the age of 25. Okay, so what can we think about in terms of the causes for this? Hey, we've got whole libraries and programs in universities talking about these things. But most people would go along with the idea that it's a mix of some genetic factors, environmental factors, and behavioural influences. So maybe a key bit is to think about why people might experience support they could have and why they may not talk to others about it, which is really, really important in terms of being able to access support for those feelings of mental distress, is as to what we might think about in terms of mental illness and some of the attitudes that I think are really powerful we need to think about in terms of reactions or maybe worries about reactions from other people. We probably all know the term Bedlam, and it comes from Bethlehem Hospital, which was set up by religious orders, actually in the 14th century originally. So if we think about Bedlam, what comes to our minds, I would suggest, is chaos, aggression, difficulties. And that's at the basis of a number of areas about what might come into people's minds when they think about mental illness, and is a challenge for us in terms of overcoming some of those things that might be problematic for people, admitting, wrong word, admitting, being able to talk about their mental distress in these ways. So very quickly, I think it's really important just to think about the history of this. So the Lunacy Act in the 19th centuries and the County Asylums Act go back to a time when we started to move towards looking at people who were behaving in ways that were different and we thought difficult, and basically locking people away. So the 1845 Act introduced reception orders where people could be mandatorily detained, which still comes through in legislation today in slightly more enlightened ways, hopefully. But this is the era of the asylums. And certainly I've worked with people who, particularly older people, who when we talk about care become really worried because their idea is about the workhouse, or has been about the workhouse and what that meant in all sorts of ways. And that relates actually to mental health issues and how we dealt with people who we thought had mental illnesses and our ways of seeing them. So let's think about some of those terms and what that might mean. The Mental Deficiency Act, 1913, there's a bit of a clue in the title there of that act. The main areas were, in terms of ideas about mental illness, were that people were feeble-minded, these are terms from the Act, by the way, and moral defectives. When I worked at Shenley Hospital many years ago, I worked with a woman who was of more mature years, and in trying to work out why she was there, I was a nursing assistant, so I wasn't necessarily, doing the treatment work as such. So I talked with the other staff about why she'd been there for so many years. She'd been taken there in her late teenage years because she was determined under that act to be a moral defective. And a moral defective was basically a woman who had a baby out of wedlock. So that kind of shows about the sort of attitudes we may have had at those points. And goodness me, how things have changed in a century or so. Okay. The Mental Health Act repealed all that, and we'll come back to it in a moment if people are interested. So there's Bedlam, moved on to the asylums and the attitudes around that. Just one last one around that about attitudes and what we think of in terms of this way. So homosexuality actually was defined as a mental disorder up until 1987. And we tend to use the American Psychological Association diagnostic and statistical measure. So at one point, people could be detained because they were homosexual, not only a criminal offence, but a mental illness. And they used to use things like aversion therapy. So you'll be given electric shocks if you were thinking homosexual thoughts. Okay, some treatments have been very interesting over the years about this. People may know about lobotomy, which is where people who are deemed to have a mental illness, who are very aggressive, would have part of the frontal lobe of the brain cut off. So it was determined that would take away the aggressive instincts. There was another one which actually, I like sleeping. It's great. I love having a doze in the afternoon. But coma therapy might be a bit much even for me. One of the ideas was you would put someone to sleep with drugs for weeks at a time, with the idea that would help settle the brain, the emotions and the humours. The other one on the brain is electroconvulsive therapy, which I'm quite sure people will have seen the videos on television and other ways about ECT, which is still used these days, by the way, under very strict control, but it's putting electric pulses through the brain, particularly where there's severe depression. So ideas from the back of all this. Sometimes people thought people had these issues because the devil had got into them. They were taken over by evil spirits. There were the ideas we had humours in us of different types that did that. Lunatic, clues in the name again, that at certain phases of the moon, some people were affected by that. We had ships of fools, if people have heard about that. So people would be put on ships and taken around the world with sailors, with the idea this would not only contain them, but be valuable, because being on the sea would help take away the things that were making them mentally ill. Moral weaknesses in there, that's that moral imbecility I spoke about earlier, but eventually became psychological ideas about people who weren't rational, they didn't have reason, the idea that people were mad and bad. And I think the issue about that is that all such connotations lead to bad images and attributions. So words like crazy, like mad, actually those two in recent years have become less discriminatory, I think, because people say, oh, I'm feeling crazy today, which is like silliness without any other really bad connotations to it. However, we still use the words such as lunatic, imbecile and idiot. And they were all classifications of mental disorder under the Mental Deficiency Act. So the only point about going into detail, I think we need to realise this is very powerful in terms of our ideas about mental illness and how we think about people who may have a mental illness, and therefore how we react to that and might support someone. If people are interested to look at this more, I think it's really important to look at people's experiences when they're able to talk about it. So I know I've looked at your YouTube channel. Gordon pointed me to that last week. Thank you. I think that looks really good, the things that you've done. I think YouTube's great for some of these things. And there are some links I've given you. They're quite short ones, 8 or 10 minutes, to really get to understand how young people might experience what's happening to them in terms of their families, in terms of school, in terms of their social grouping, their own feelings about themselves. So that's one of those. There's another one where young people from an organisation give advice to us as adults about mental health and how to respond to that. Again, quite a short one. I'd recommend that if people are interested. Legislation, probably done enough of that already, but just to let you know, the Mental Health Act, and I was once something called an Approved Mental Health Practitioner. So if doctors determined that someone had one of the mental illnesses, either a relative or myself in that position could sign some papers and the person would be taken away against their will, sometimes with the police there as well, to a psychiatric hospital and be detained for a period of time. All sorts of human rights elements of that now which have come into place, but it's still there. The important thing about that is there has never been in any of the legislation a minimum age for those sorts of interventions. So actually there are a number of young people at the moment who are in adult psychiatric hospitals detained under the Mental Health Act, some of them quite young, in adult institutions. Okay, so maybe some of the key points about some of this to be taken into account, just generally about how we approach mental health challenges and those who are trying to deal with them best they can. I think there's something important about understanding of warning signs and behaviours and young people's experiences. Young people can feel desperately lonely. Social media can help, but it can also be a great strain and a problem in terms of bullying if people admit to any weakness, as might be seen, to their social media contacts. People can get very negative about their own well-being and the ability to change and have support. And that's why I went into detail in some of those things about the importance of these things which come down through the generations, which can affect our ideas about mental illness and how we approach someone. Quite often, someone for a number of reasons can reject advice and concern. And it's really important that we're able to stick with someone over the longer term and be able to show support even in tiny ways, which later on can become important for that young person to come back again, to start to learn to trust someone, that they're not going to be overbearing, they're not going to be judgmental, but they're there when someone is ready to do that. So it's how to recognize when someone's withdrawing, when someone's talking. Now, we know with adolescents, the idea is they can be very surly and they can be very off. Okay, all of that. This is at another level. This is working from a baseline where we know someone and they can change quite quickly in terms of these sorts of problems. Might talk less, might be very secretive, might be difficulties in education, particularly with friendships and relation to family relationships. And in some cases, not all by any means, people can get aggressive and negative. I was part of something with the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence a few years ago on a guideline on violence and aggression in mental health. And actually, people who have a mental health problem are much more likely to be the subject of violence than carry it out themselves. Okay, really important to be aware of that, please. Parents who are caring for young people can often feel exhausted, frustrated, as though they're not doing a proper parent's job, are they? Otherwise, things will be okay for their child or young person. They can feel angry. They can feel there's no end to it because of how long it's going on for. And it can affect the adults' relationships as well. Carrying out a piece of work recently with a mother who had her daughter had eating disorders and mental health problems over a long period of time, and talking with her about the types of support she felt she needed from people while that was happening for her was really very instructive about how we can best be there for people at times like that. The labelling and stigma, I've talked about that quite a lot. So it's about possible responses to caring approaches for family members, from members of family and professionals. So wider family support is absolutely key. So how about some of the responses that there are for young people and families? Okay. Some young people are facing waiting times of up to 18 months when they do feel able to come forward. And if it is felt that professional help is needed, the waiting lists are very long. And actually the criteria to even get on the waiting list can be quite high because of the level of resources that there are particularly in the statutory services. And that comes from the Care Quality Commission 2018. So civil society as well as government have really important parts to play in this. So organisations, the small charities, the larger charities, the work we do outside of government and NHS and social services, absolutely key in these areas. I was part of Hearts Young Homeless for 10 years until very recently. And a number of our areas of intervention related to mental health issues to support those young people where that was related also to homelessness in that way. So counselling and individual therapy can be indicated for certain types of distress for young people. Family therapy, particularly something called systemic family therapy, is seen as being valuable. But one of the big things that's come along in recent years, both for adults and for young people, is something called cognitive behavioural therapy. People may know about that. You can ask me more about it in the questions if you wish. But that's short-term therapy, and it's based on ways people think about themselves and what they do. So it's helping to learn different ways of thinking about something, from negative thinking to more positive thinking. That's putting it very simplistically. Happy to talk more about that if people want to. So there's been something in recent years called improving access to psychological therapies, with the idea we need to move away from the medical interventions, which have their place, but can have the contraindications as well. So that talking therapies is gaining traction a lot and has been for the last 15 years, including in services for children and young people. Okay, nearly done now, folks. Peer support's really important. What's happening now is, particularly in charities and civic society, more and more we're looking at things called recovery approaches. And part of that is having peer support. So the professionals are involved, but people who've been through those problems themselves are increasingly working alongside professionals and in other agencies when they feel ready to and are supported to support those young people who are going through the same sorts of things. It really is quite a major feature of what we're doing now. And we do quite a lot of work on that at the university. And we have an online program which is about mental health recovery and social inclusion. And I'm actually very proud of that one because it was developed with service users and carers who've been through these issues and have now felt able to come forward to work on that, to improve things for other people. And every year, it's a totally online program, it's a master's program. Every year, half of the people who come to do that are actually people who have been or are service users or carers in mental health services. Group work is seen as important, sharing things between people, facilitated. So RAP groups, it's known as Wellness Recovery Action Planning, is one way this happens. So they're peer-led group programs, and Bernardo's has done quite a lot of work in recent years in terms of developing those. I'm going to go over this bit. I realise I've been talking quite a while now. There are some promising areas in education that's been found by Public Health England. I'll leave people to look at that if you want. This is being recorded, I know, and you'll have these slides to look at. So at the moment, around 240,000 children and young people are on the caseloads of NHS mental health services at any one time. There are 35,000 new referrals each month, and there's a target for the NHS to have 70,000 more children and young people to be seen each year. I think that's quite a small number myself, given the need, but hey, it's great that the emphasis has been given there. In terms of what we're saying about stigma and self-stigma, one of the important messages now from the government, and I completely go along with this, is that mental health should be the same as physical health. So we take away all these ideas about morality, about weakness. It's about health. And it's a different way of seeing it, other than the deficit-based approach and the stigmatizing approach that I was talking about earlier. So there's an aim to end inappropriate placements for children and young people, and pilot programs to have single points of contact, for example, between NHS services and schools, because schools is an important place to be picking up some of these early signs. Okay, support agencies, last few slides, you'll be pleased to hear. So some of the major ones, there are a lot. These are some of the ones I would pick out as Young Minds is a major UK charity that we work with quite a lot. The address is there, all sorts of advice there about these sorts of issues we're talking about. And it has a parent helpline for parents who want to make contact and get support for them. The CAM service, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, is the main feature from the NHS. Again, the website address is there if people want to know about that. They provide interventions, moderate, severe, emotional, behavioural difficulties, specialist services such as anorexia, schizophrenia, and they provide both community and inpatient services. And in them, they have child psychiatrists, clinical and counselling psychologists, social workers, psychotherapists, family therapists and specialist nurses. To that list, we should now add peer supporters, expert by experience. They are being employed by the trusts in that peer support mechanism that I mentioned earlier. Another really good organisation, I think, does some excellent work in this field is Charlie Waller Memorial Trust. Again, websites there. And people know Alexander Armstrong. He himself had experience amongst his friendship network of a young person who went through serious mental health difficulties. He's a patron of that. And he does a really good video presentation, including young people's views on their well-being and being able to talk about this. And they do free resources for parents, professionals, and others. Okay, last one. Another YouTube one I think is useful. It's from America, but hey, if we can put up with the accent and the spelling, it's really quite good. And it's 10 common warning signs to have early warning. Okay, I think some watchwords and phrases we can think about. What's really important, if we might be aware of this for a young person or a family going through this, is being non-judgmental. It's about patience and perseverance. It's acceptance of risk. Self-harm and suicide are possibilities in these situations. It's to be aware that can be the case. It's rare, but can be the case. Key issue is to be ready when the young person or the parent, whoever it is ready to talk about it, and not being over assertive and advising too much. There can be an awful thing to get involved. Well, why don't you do this? What about that? That's not what people need. They need a listening ear, they need sympathy, and they know they can build up trust to go back to someone to have further discussions when and if they think that's what they want to do. So the tiniest of openings can be really important, and the right response is absolutely crucial, is what we know from people who've been through this. I'm not going to this, but the Johari window and the drama triangle, they come from ideas in my sort of work about understanding how we come across to others. So the Johari window says, I might think I'm being very thoughtful and caring, but actually other people might be seen as overbearing. And the drama triangle is I'm trying to do too much, and I think I'm there to help someone, but they think I'm making life difficult for them. So crucial bits, how a young person and the carers might be experiencing their mental health problems and others' approaches. You'll be pleased to hear that's the last one. Thank you very much, everyone. So please, questions, queries, challenges about the things that I've been saying will be very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was fascinating. Could I ask you to take down your slide so I can see all the pictures on the screen? Thanks very much. Right, so it's open. I'll unmute everybody, and we're open for questions.
I do have a question.
Yes, carry on.
Yes, Umar Daniels. I used to be a member of your group. I'm a consultant psychiatrist.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
So that was really very enjoyable, Professor Littlechild. Very much I'm an adult psychiatrist. You'd be relieved to hear, not a child psychiatrist. But I just wondered, what was the role of substance misuse in the presentation of illness in young people?
Okay. You'll know very well, Omar, and probably better than I do, about the relationship between things like the Mental Health Act, definition of mental illness, the place of that in terms of diagnosis. So, for example, the crossover points between what can come from misuse of alcohol and other drugs. It can look like it's psychotic experiences. It can look like a whole load of things. We know, for example, and please tell me if I'm on the right track or not, but we do know, for example, the overuse of cannabis amongst young people can lead to long-term psychotic conditions. Not common, but it can happen. So we know that there are issues that can affect people in the long term in terms of their mental health. The other types, of course, in terms of alcohol, you will know better than I do, but they do affect the brain over a long period of time. And with real excess, it can cause long-term problems of memory and concentration, etc., etc. I don't know if I'm anywhere near what you were asking there, Omar, please.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think Peter Latham has a question.
I've got one, Gordon.
Okay. Okay, we'll take Hugh McLean first of all. And then Sarah.
Gordon, sorry, there's a background. You could turn off the radio or whatever it is.
Somebody's got a radio in the background running.
We've had, in terms of the work with students in this way over the last week or so, of course, they're all at home. We've had the dogs, we've had the babies, we've had all sorts of things. So,
okay, can I just introduce myself? Hello, Brian. I did the Masters with you some years ago. Sarah Williams from Carers and
Hello, Sarah. I did recognise you. I did recognise you in the bottom left-hand corner for me just now. But very nice to see you again.
And you, Brian. Noel Young very kindly invited me. I do actually recognise a few faces. As I say, I work with Carers in Hertfordshire. For some years now, we've actually developed a project where we offer support to parents and carers whose young people are using the CAM service in Hertfordshire, that being the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. So if any of you know of people whose young people are going through those services, please do contact Carers and Hearts, because we offer a monthly support group. This obviously was face-to-face before lockdown, with myself as a facilitator, and also somebody who's a clinician from HPFT And we also run more recently, again until lockdown, a 6-week programme aimed at parents whose children are using those services. So there is a very small amount of support in Hertfordshire, but it is there. So I think perhaps Brian, you and I could, after this sometime, link up, because I think it will be good. It's good for the university to know that that support is out there.
Please, thank you, sir, and really good to see you again. And as you probably know, we work quite a lot with carers in Hearts in various projects and the teaching of our students, etc., etc. And I think one of the things that comes across really clearly in this area, and the parents that I've spoken to around this in the other ways, is the statutory agencies, I think, do the best they can. We can then discuss about resources, all sorts of things, but actually going in and making use of those services in those professional environments can be really difficult all in itself, okay, of that approach for a number of reasons. Some of them we may have been speaking about this evening, there are others as well. So actually I think, and it's not just because we work with you, Sarah, okay, but agencies like Carers in Hearts, in my view, deserve an awful lot more support in all sorts of ways, because you provide things in ways that others don't. And providing for carers, and we know that at the moment through COVID. Well, we had to get it in somewhere, didn't we? But we know the pressures there are in families at the moment in all sorts of ways. So being able to support carers in ways that carers can accept, because sometimes it's difficult to go along to those statutory agencies, even if they're available, which often they aren't. So please, yeah, very happy, Sarah, to follow up on that, of course.
And also just another useful resource, again, for some of you, you may want to pass this information on. There is a very useful document, it's about 16 pages, but a good read, called My Teen Brain. It's on the Herts County Council website. If you Google My Teen Brain, it very much looks at the development of the teenage brain and all that holds, looks at hormones, reasons why sometimes teenagers won't talk or won't communicate, and also different parenting styles. A really good read, which I would recommend.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. Hugh McLean's got a question.
Thank you, Gordon. Brian, two parts to the question. First of all, what is the role of physical activity in improving mental health?
Shall I do that one first? You said you've got two. Yep. It's really very important. We know for a number of, and there's quite a lot of research been done on this recently. Hugh, is it Hugh? Have I got that right?
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yes,
yep. There's quite a lot of research been done recently, and it's partly about doing something, but it's partly about what that does to your body and what hormones it releases. So, for example, I think it's, I'm not a medical doctor, okay, but it's something like serotonin. So if you do exercise, it releases things in a way that makes you feel better. So particularly for depression, we know that that can be a real indicator to have physical exercise. Some people can't do physical exercise very much because of their physical illnesses as well. But as far as possible, there are all sorts of ways in which we might be able to help support people to get physical exercise, and it's regular physical exercise. This is not doing, you know, dumbbells. This is aerobic exercise. Partly because of what it does to the body, but partly because of those hormones that it releases when we do enough of that sort of exercise regularly enough. I don't know if that answers your question, Hugh.
Yeah, but how do we move? We seem to be what you've described tonight very well. It seems to be a very professional approach, statutory agency support for mental health, whereas the physical activity side of it is probably, or has to be, better served in the community.
Yes.
So how do we make that linkages between the professional side and the community side, which seems to be there in many ways on physical health,
yeah,
but not there on mental health?
Yeah, and I think that's partly because of this issue about how we've seen mental illness in the past, Hugh. I do crack on about this, I know, but it's partly about our own way of thinking about it and those agencies, okay? So professionals have a particular way of looking at the world, and my particular thing is called co-production. So I work very closely on projects and teaching with service users and carers, because actually they are the experts about their own areas, okay? as part of that, as what you're talking, I think you're absolutely right. The statutory agencies aren't really set up for things like that anymore. At one point, I think we were, but we're not really anymore. So there's something now known as social prescribing, which is becoming part of various physical health areas, but also mental health. And I think that's something about us as professionals being able to work better with what I call civic society. If there's a better term, please let me know. But it's us. It's us. We are civic society. Okay. So it's there. For me, one of the things I'm interested in is, you know, cycling groups with mind. Okay. So it's getting people to be able to do something they might enjoy, get out. It's partly sociable stuff as well. But it's also that physical bit. So it's something about professionals having it in their mind to think about those things for what we call social prescribing, because we all need, people need a name for it in my sort of business. But I think absolutely right. And it's actually how we in the community can offer things, but then how do people get to know about us? And how do they feel welcome to join what we might be able to do? I think that's the key bit for the agencies and how we might let other people know what we're doing and what could be joined in with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Norma?
Yeah, Brian, we have social prescribing in Bishop Stortford, Salisbury and all around there. We have a chap called Simon Marlowe, and he works for the CCG, and he does all this, a lot of the social prescribing, and East Hart's taken a lead on it as well, and it's been so successful. We've set up chatter tables, we've set up meal times, we've set up loads of stuff in this area, and it really is making a difference to people's lives, especially those with mental health problems.
Thank you, Norma. And I'm sure you've been involved in some of those things,
Yes,
developing it. I'm absolutely sure about that. And I think there's a real element in there. People like me are always arguing for increased resources for the areas we think are important. Okay, that's what we do. There's another bit about civil society where the things that you've just been talking about and others been talking about, that Hugh was talking about just now, is what we can do amongst ourselves. And I think one of the issues about that is there can be a tendency to exclude people in terms of mental health if they have mental health problems. Okay, so there's something there about how we approach that in our own communities and about inclusion as well that we might want to think about ourselves. So, and that doesn't cost a lot of money. That is actually about what we can do for each other in our civil society. And I think that's equally as important, if not more important, than some of the professional services. It's, as Hugh was saying, I think there, it's how we link those two bits together and increase capacity of both, I would argue, that becomes important for people's well-being and getting involved in things.
Brian, I know I've got a bit of experience in the physical side, and we've had a reasonable number, a smallish number of people with severe mental health issues, but actually just being treated as having a health issue rather than it being either physical or health. They are just somebody who needs help.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent that, but the biggest change I think that we have seen, and we've been doing social prescribing for 10 years, is the attitude of the senior people in the medical profession, because the tendency has been traditionally that they know best, whereas actually people and what things happening in the community has potentially got more benefit to the person than actually going through the purely sort of NHS traditional route.
Yeah. And for lots of mental health challenges that people have, even if they do need professional help as well, for me, there's something about association. Some people don't want association. They want to be isolated and be on them by themselves. But that's okay, but we still need to think how we support someone the best we can if that is their experience at that time. But I think association is important. And many of the people I work with on projects, not as a social worker, but on projects developing things, is people will say, I want to be seen as me, as a person, not as an illness or a label. And I think that's really, really, really important.
Thank you. Peter Latham had a question.
Peter
And
Latham.
Brian, can I just say, sorry,
Peter
one of
Latham
the
first,
most one of the most helpful things to men is men in sheds.
Yes. Yep. I know it. Yes.
I was an honorary man for a day when we opened the first one in Stortford. There's another one opening and another one as well. So we'll have 3 in Stortford.
I think he's trying to get a question from
So
Peter Latham first.
successful.
Yep. People might want to look that up. Men in sheds. It's yeah. Thanks, Donna. Yeah.
Right, let's try Peter Latham again.
Okay, I'm a member, Peter Latham, I'm a member of the club. My awareness of mental health and the issues surrounding it is derived mainly from the media. But one thing that seems to come over clearly to me is that one of the primary sources of mental health, and particularly obviously in young children, is broken homes. And then we don't seem to do much to improve the situation by the way we deal with the victim, the children, broken homes, in the way we care for them, in the way that, now maybe I'm getting a jaundiced picture from the media, but it does seem to me, from what I observe, this is the case. Mental health from broken homes, and then the way we foster children and look after them afterwards leaves a lot to be desired. Is that the truth, or is that just the media making a story?
There's some elements to that, yes, and it depends how we think what a broken home is. I think what I would say is, from what we know from the research, it's not necessarily that where, for example, parents split up one way or another. That's not necessarily the issue for young people's experiences of difficulties. It's actually the fighting between the parents that goes on, which is the problem. And people may know about mediation services. I was involved in mediation services in Hertfordshire for a number of years and chair a couple of times. The idea being, we were trying to offer a service which would talk about the children in the main. We did the money bits as well, because that's part of where all the problems are, of course. But we would train mediators to try and stop it, to get to the point where the acrimony was such that that would have the really negative effects on the children and young people. So I think the idea is to try and stop those bad things between the parents, which can really affect not all young people. This is not determining. Some young people go through the most acrimonious things with their parents, and there's lots of different factors in this, but in general, you're more likely to suffer insecurity, depression, some sort of anxiety, if that constant fighting between the parents, and frankly over you as well, because you become part of the tug of war, of course, and that's really difficult to go through. So yes, there is that as well. In terms of where children have to end up in public care, children looked after, we know they're particularly vulnerable. And again, that's partly because of disruption with the family, or sometimes their relationships with the family are not ones that work out well for them. They always want to go back to their family and make it all okay. Sometimes that works, but quite often it doesn't, and that can create real difficulties for young people. So we know young people in the public care, for example, require extra support through the difficulties from that. But I don't know if I've answered your question properly. I sometimes wander off on something I think is interesting. Please let me know if I've got anyone anywhere near answering what you asked, please.
Could I invite one last question, please? David Scott. Also, and Colin George has got a question as well.
Brian, Can You Save the World is the name of a computer game launched by your colleague Richard Wiseman this week. Is that, and it seems to be very low cost to create, is that something that could be used in your field to get at children early in their life?
Okay, I'm going to be, I should know about that. And I need to look it up, so thank you for telling me. I've known Richard for many, many years, and he's done all sorts of it, including, he did research on the funniest joke in the world. So Richard's got research on the funniest joke in the world as well. It's actually, humour can also be important in people's well-being. Not put down humour, but gentle humour can be really important. Laughing is important for our well-being and mental health. Anyway,
Well, this
so I
game is
must
about
look it up. I
filming.
must look it up. So I don't know it, and I should know it, and that's really terrible that I don't. Please.
Okay, could I now invite Colin George for the last question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Brian, a few months ago, we decided as a club to look for a mental health project relating to children. And we did some desk research really on looking at what's being done in the preventative area, trying to head off problems before they actually arise. And we had some experience in another project of working with primary schools. So we looked for a project that would actually could perhaps stop some of these problems arising by a bit more exposure to young people in primary schools on the issues of mental health. And we sought out an organisation that we could actually sponsor and work with. And we came across a company in the Hertfordshire area, Bishop Stortford, and Anne Kreitzman is the manages it, who's joined in our session today and might want to say a few words. But we thought we needed a project that was already, or a model that was had already been developed and that had some success elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And we came across a model called protective behaviours. It would be interesting to hear, first of all, to know whether you think that model is really of value, and what you think about the whole issue of preventative, like as we talk about preventative physical health, what more should we be doing in the area of preventative mental health?
Okay. Thank you for that. And I think that that's a good choice. I'm not saying that just because I think Anne is there, you were saying. But I think it's really important to go along to see, starting stuff up from scratch is difficult in a number of ways. So to be working on something that we know has got some traction and got some success is a really important one. I think things like protective behaviours, there are a number of good programs around. If I'm honest, I think one of the most important things we know from the research is that you get people who are committed to what they're doing, going about it in a way that people feel as though they've been taken care of. That may sound rather simplistic, but if you're going into primary schools and providing maybe teachers with support and with those children with forms of support, it's not necessarily going along saying, you know, what we've been talking about tonight. Okay. It's about knowing what the risk factors are and helping young people think about what's going on in their own lives and how they deal with difficulties. And as we've seen earlier, that comes from a very young age these days. Maybe it's always been the case, but we've just never looked for it. But it's from a very young age. And most of the work down like Public Health England, I skipped over that slide a bit, but we know, and I've done a bit of work with the Council of Europe on this, with their work, and we've seen that schools are one of the major ways of both identifying and supporting young people. And that's not necessarily in an individualistic way. It's in a group way. You do exercises, you make things fun. So it becomes something about a way of thinking about the world and about yourself, and that you're a person of worth, that becomes really important. There are some young people who fall out of education at very young ages. So that's a different kettle of fish. You have to think something different about there. But in the main, most people would recognise in preventive services, schools are absolutely key. And you'll probably know that, you know, a year or two ago, there was an initiative from the government to train specialist teachers, one in each school, to be working on this area. Now, I'm not quite sure how that's worked out in practice, but I think that's absolutely key. You need, if you like, a standard bearer, I think, in a school, because they have so many pressures on them in so many ways. How do we keep those things alive in those environments, which people want to do, but can be difficult to get into your daily work pressures, as I say. So it's something about focus and the tools that you use. Main bit is there are people there doing something and opening up the discussions and taking it forward.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. This is fascinating, and the level of questioning just shows that everyone is very engaged with the subject. As far as I can see, we've come a long way in the last 20 or 30 years, but there's a long, long way to go yet. So thank you so much for your talk. And could I invite everyone to lift their glasses and toast Rotary, peace and health, the world order, and also the Queen. Rotary and the Queen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I've enjoyed our discussion. I hope it's been useful for you as well.
You've all got just to press the off button.